We are excited to have in the studio right now Alexandra Noël, who is the Associate Professor of Comparative Biomedical Sciences at LSU. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, we're excited to talk to you about your research, which I know revolves around vaping in adolescents. I'm always interested in finding out what drew someone to their field of research.
Well, I first starting looking at the effects of air pollution particles, and that has how the particles that are in the air, how that affects our lungs. And then I moved on to studying the effects of secondhand smoke. And as e-cigarettes were introduced on the US market in 2007, well, they have grown in popularity. And then my research has evolved from research on secondhand smoke to research on e-cigarettes.
You mentioned their popularity. I recently read a PATH study that said 14% of adults from ages 18 to 24 reported regular use of e-cigarettes. I thought that was such a large number. So what are the potential dangers in having vapes so widely available on the market, and does that affect your research at all?
Well, they are widely available, and also the FDA is trying to put regulation. There are also some states specifically that have more restrictive regulation when it comes to vaping products, but they are available for adults. The age to buy e-cig products is 21 years and over. However, there's a lot of high school and middle school students that still have, unfortunately, access to those products. And because they're not necessarily cigarette smokers that are trying to quit and using vaping products to transition to stopping any nicotine tobacco products, but the youth is actually being initiated to those nicotine products with vaping. So that's why it's something that public health should be concerned of, because a lot of those youth are being attracted to the different flavors that are on the market, and then those adolescents start vaping, and then sometimes they could grow to using more conventional tobacco products like just regular cigarettes.
And do you feel like that's hard because there's not a wide understanding of their effects right now?
Yes, I think a lot of the general public still thinks that vaping is safe. Although it could be safer than conventional cigarettes, it doesn't mean that it's safe for your lungs or your health in general. So I think there's the public perceives it as a safe method of getting nicotine.
And I assume more research needs to be done to inform people about that safety.
Correct, yes. So there's definitely more research that needs to be done, looking also at the chronic effects. When, let's say, somebody who's an adolescent starts vaping, in 15 years, 20 years, what could be the chronic effects on their lungs or on their cardiovascular system? So definitely something that needs more research on.
Is there a lot known about those effects right now?
So there's a lot of research going on to know what are the effects of the long-term effects of vaping, but a lot of studies are also showing acute effects of vaping on the lungs. So even clinical studies are showing that there are some effects on lung function, so on the parameters of the lungs that are supposed to be normal when you breathe in and out. So those effects are present, but there's definitely more research that needs to be done for chronic effects.
So I know that your research compares third generation to fourth generation vapes. Explain what those are and then what you found the differences are.
Yes, so the e-cig device were first introduced on the US market in 2007, and they have evolved from first generation, second generation to third generation, which is still very popular today. And third generation device actually are devices where the features could be customized by the users. So they could change the power that they apply to the device. They could also change the atomizer coil, and they could change the e-liquid that they pour in the device. So basically, the users could personalize their vaping experience through those third generation e-cig device. After the third generation came the fourth generation device that were made very popular because they were simple devices where the user cannot change any settings. All they could do is change a pod, or you have the ones ones that are one-time use, and they also contain nicotine salt, which allows for a higher concentration of nicotine to be used without having a harsh hit or harsh throat hit when the users are inhaling. And I do think that the vast majority of the adolescents who are vaping are currently vaping the fourth generation devices because they were also available in a wide variety of flavors.
Interesting. And have you found the effects are different from the third to fourth generations?
Yes, so we have done a study studying starting to expose mice when they were adolescents, and that allow us to see that when they were exposed to third or fourth generation e-cig with the same amount of nicotine and the same type of flavor, that we did see difference in terms of the long-term effect that we would see when we're talking about chronic effects. So the mice that were exposed to third generation e-cig device that had a phenotype that was closely related to fibrosis versus we didn't see the same phenotype with the mice that were exposed to the fourth generation e-cig device.
So even the type of device that people are smoking may affect their health.
Yes, and that was mainly, we tried to keep all the parameters similar between the two devices. The only, the flavor was the same, the nicotine concentration, but the nicotine form, which was freebase in the third generation e-cig device versus nicotine salt in the fourth generation e-cig device, that was mainly what was making the difference.
Now, in terms of methodology, can you talk a little bit about what types of methodology you use in your study?
So in general, the research that we conduct would use both in vitro as well as in vivo models. So in vitro would be more in cells, looking at cells from the lungs and trying to understand the mechanism by which the e-cig aerosol is having an effect, as well as in vivo models, so where we use, for example, rodents, and where we're also trying to understand the effects.
And tell us about the results of some of your findings and how the mice have maybe had some kind of effects, adverse reactions. Have you seen that?
Like I mentioned, we did see with the third generation that we had a phenotype that was close to fibrosis. And after the recovery period, so we did leave the mice for 2 weeks without any exposure at the end, and we saw that the majority of those lung function parameters came back to baseline, so came back to normal. So those findings showed that even if we had a phenotype of a chronic lung disease, if it was stopped, it was able to come back to more baseline or control level 2 weeks after the exposure.
Wow, that's powerful to learn that. That's interesting. Okay, so you mentioned that a lot of people think that it's safer to smoke an e-cigarette compared to a real cigarette. What do you think that would compare in the results to somebody smoking a cigarette or a cigar?
Well, obviously we're not comparing, they're not inhaling the same thing. So cigarettes has all the byproducts from the combustion, which we don't have with the electronic cigarettes, but we do have some byproducts of the heating process of the e-liquid. So in general, what the literature has shown is that if somebody is using cigarettes for a long time and if they start vaping, well, that could be kind of a harm reduction, but it doesn't necessarily bring you back to a control level, which is not being exposed to anything. So that's where there's a difference to say that, for example, e-cigarette could be safer than cigarettes, but they are not safe in the sense that it's all in your comparison point. If your comparison point is something that is worse, obviously what vaping is not as bad. But if your comparison point is, for example, breathing fresh air, which the lungs were made to breathe air, then yes, vaping could have adverse effects on the lungs. So it's always a perspective that you take. I think it's always important to remember that we're supposed to compare it to somebody who doesn't vape. So if we compare it to abstinence, then yes, vaping could have adverse effects.
So you mentioned there was that 2-week period you studied in the mice that took them back to baseline if they stopped being around the vape. Do you think that would be different if it went longer and longer, where they were using it and then stopped after a longer period of use?
Yes, that's a possibility. So for our study that was an effect on lung function it went back to almost baseline level, but it doesn't mean that at the molecular level there are not other dysregulation that are occurring. Even if it stopped, doesn't mean that the other outcomes would necessarily go back to normal. So the fact that the lung function went back to normal is definitely something good, but it doesn't mean that there's not other alteration at other levels that are not persisting following the exposure.
As medical and recreational marijuana becomes a larger and larger industry, it seems like, do you think there's a similar risk in vaping devices built for THC?
I haven't researched THC per se because that's another kind of I would say legal hoop that we have to go through in order to do research on THC products. But what we have seen with the EVALI outbreak, so EVALI for the e-cig or vaping associated lung injury outbreak that occurred in 2019, that was mainly associated with the presence of THC in those vaping products. So I do think that the effects could be different, but definitely something that people need to be careful of.
Okay. With all your research you've done, would you recommend any regulatory changes for vape use?
Trying to reduce the numbers of flavors that are out there will definitely, what we would hope is that it would reduce the number of youth that are attracted to those vaping products. So if there could be regulation, for example, on the vaping flavors that are available, and maybe just keep tobacco as a flavor, and all the other flavors that has to do with fruits, etc., not have them on the market. And also maybe what would be important too, or could have an impact, would be to limit the amount of nicotine that could be allowed to be in those e-liquid. So I know that other countries have regulation in the amount of nicotine that are allowed in the vaping products, and they're lower than the concentrations that are allowed in the US.
Such a fascinating topic to study. So thanks for sharing your insights with us. We appreciate it. Alexandra Noël.
Thank you.